Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're continuing to cover the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and we're also having a look at other events of the day. Now, what I want to do is move from Eastern Europe to Cuba. Now, I want to read to you an article that is coming out of the mainstream media. And you'll see different variations of this article. You will see different variations of the report about what is happening. So let's start off with the article specifically. A fleet of Russian warships. Let me say that again for you. A fleet of Russian warships has reached Cuban waters ahead of planned military exercises in the Caribbean in what some see as a projection of strength as tensions grow over Western support for the Ukraine. 3 ships slowly crossed the mouth of Havana Bay, accompanied by small boats that guided them through the narrow channel. So this fleet of warships is 3 ships. But wait, it gets better. The flagship frigate, let me say that again, the flagship frigate, not a battle cruiser, not a destroyer, a frigate, adorned with Russian and Cuban flags, was greeted by a 21-cannon salute. Sailors in dress uniform stood in military formation as they approached the island. A nuclear-powered submarine was expected to arrive behind them. Now look, if I was the United States, I would be more concerned about the capabilities of the Russian Federation that cannot be seen, the likes of those nuclear attack boats. The U.S. military expects the exercises will involve a handful of Russian ships and support vessels, which may also stop in Venezuela. Russia is a longtime ally of Venezuela and Cuba, and its warships and aircraft have periodically made forays into the Caribbean. But this mission comes less than 2 weeks after U.S. President Joseph Biden authorized Ukraine, to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike inside of Russia to protect Kharkov, Ukraine's second-largest city, prompting President Vladimir Putin to suggest his military could respond with asymmetrical steps elsewhere in the world. The Biden administration has described Russia's Caribbean excursion as a routine naval activity, downplaying it as a provocation. Now look, if you listen to other media outlets, you would think that a battle fleet the size of something out of Jutland in World War I was approaching the southern American coast. It's really interesting and hyperbolic to see just how bad the propaganda arm of U.S. media can actually be. And in reality, again, a very small flotilla, not a fleet, of Russian ships in which the flagship is a frigate. A frigate. So there you have it. Now, if there was to be a war between a Russo-Sino alliance, it's not going to matter about these kinds of very small surface flotillas. It's going to be the subsurface warfare arm of the Russian Navy that would probably give the U.S. Navy some of its biggest challenges. It's still a very capable naval force with newer nuclear-powered cruise missile attack submarines that are being deployed. It is the systems that the U.S. can't see or isn't reporting that they're there. Now, look, there have been reports in the past that Russian nuclear attack boats have prowled the Gulf of Mexico, have gotten very close to the port of New Orleans. And in the event of war, if a Russian nuclear attack boat or a cruise missile submarine were to get into the Gulf of Mexico, it could play havoc by launching cruise missile attacks on various concerns along the southern U.S. coast. So again, it's the systems that you can't see, that you don't know about, that aren't being reported about, that could end up being the biggest threat to the United States. Again, this small flotilla is not that, and in some cases it's being portrayed as something that it is simply not. Also wanted to mention the Hunter crackhead Biden found guilty of attempting or lying on his background check to purchase a handgun. What are your thoughts on that? I got to tell you, I think most of you know where I stand on crackhead Biden. However, I got to say I disagree with this charge. I believe that the second is absolute, and that is the way it is. If that man wants to go out and buy a gun, then by all means, go buy a gun. And again, that's just the way it is. Look, freedom can be scary at times. And eventually, crackhead Biden will do something other than not telling the complete truth on a firearms application that will, in all probability, land him in prison. He's got charges in California, tax evasion charges, probably other stuff that's coming as well. But it's interesting to see that they really focused on that firearms charge. So we'll see what happens. We shall see what happens. The war continues. Let's have a look at what is being reported in some of the mainstream media in regards to the ongoing war in Ukraine. This is European Pravda. European Pravda, right? Ukraine will receive first F-16 this summer, Dutch Defense Minister says. NATO head says Hungary won't veto support for Ukraine, but will not participate. Germany, its allies, will transfer 100 Patriot air defense missiles to Ukraine. U.S. to send another Patriot air defense system to Ukraine. Now, whenever you see the media state that the U.S. is going to send another Patriot air defense system, that means the one prior was blown up. It was destroyed. Now, that doesn't get talked about, but this is how you have to read the code speak of this conflict. So again, when you hear U.S. to send another Patriot air defense system to Ukraine, that means they're backfilling one that got blown up. EU unveils $1.4 billion plan to boost Ukraine's economy. Yeah, without direct injection of cash and treasure, the Ukrainian economy would have long ago collapsed. Long ago. The war would, in all probability, not be continuing. No one's getting paid. No one would be getting paid within the Ukrainian state. And those politicians, those high-ranking military commanders, in all probability, a lot of them aren't going to do the job for no money. There are Western military units. There are let's just call it what they are, contractors / mercenaries that are fighting in Ukraine for the Ukrainians, that are being paid large sums of money. There are contractors with very specialized skill sets that are being paid large amounts of money to go to the Ukraine and support the Ukrainian military. And do you believe that they're doing that for Ukrainian patriotic reasons? No, they're not. They're doing it for a paycheck. They're making large sums of money in doing so. Ukraine extends blackouts as Russian bombings continue. So the Russians continue airstrikes and cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian targets throughout the Ukraine. Again, this war of attrition that is not going to stop. G7 to announce new steps about using frozen Russian assets to support the Ukraine. Death toll from missile attack on Kryvyi Rih rises to 8. At least 21 people injured, 4 went missing. Now that's interesting as well, because the Russians were going after something. As I've talked about before, if the Russians were making a concerted attempt to target the civilian populace, the civil populace of the Ukraine, the casualty levels and the casualty figures, which would actually be reported by the Ukrainians, would be astronomical, would be beyond comprehension. So when you hear about these smaller numbers of casualties on the Ukrainian side, in all probability that was collateral damage from a military target that the Russians went after, whether it was a supply depot, whether it was a command and control site, whether it was a barracks being used by the Ukrainians to house Ukrainian troops. Remember, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to use existing military bases and existing military barracks. This very large Ukrainian military has to sleep somewhere, okay? And the Russians have targeted many of these barracks, these military bases. So the Ukrainians have to house its army someplace, and it's currently being housed in what was civilian buildings. So the Russians identify the civilian buildings that are being used by the Ukrainians to house troops, and then they go after those buildings, just like the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians are doing the same exact thing as well. When you hear about those ATACMS strikes and you'll hear about Russian troops being killed, that's what's happening. In all probability, those Russian troops are being housed in what was eastern Ukraine, in buildings that were former civilian sites. And the same thing happens. Civilian casualties. Let's see, what else do we have here today? Sweden is sending recon planes to Ukraine. Interesting. Taking additional measures to degrade Russia's wartime economy. Well, the sanctions did not work. And you continually hear about how Russia is this petrol-based economy. That's not the only resource that the Russians have. The Russians are one of the top gold producers in the world. Not just gold, but other precious metals as well, in what you would call rare earth metals. They have massive amounts of resources. Massive amounts. And the Chinese are buying a lot of those resources. So whatever the Russians need that maybe the Chinese have, then obviously the Chinese are going to hand over those resources. So the Russians have protected themselves. They have protected their economy through the use of a non-fiat system of barter, meaning no debt, limited debt, and gold. So there you have it. Yeah, do your own research on that. Again, one would say that the Russian economy was better prepared for this conflict than other economies around the world. Even obviously the U.S. economy, which is a utter mess. The debt is going to eventually kill the U.S. dollar. It's absolute 100% certainty that is going to happen. The dollar is eventually going to die. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's happening. So there you have it. One more conflict that I have not covered much as of yet. You know, we have looked at Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have covered the war in the former state of Ethiopia. But there's one conflict that is becoming increasingly brutal that is very rarely ever talked about whatsoever. And that is the civil war taking place in Myanmar. This is a brutal war, and right now it is reported that the government of Myanmar controls about anywhere from 40 to 60% of the country at any one time. Right now, there is in excess of 100,000 rebels fighting against the Myanmar military government. Now, we're going to bring you more coverage on this conflict very soon. We want to look at the structure of the Myanmar armed forces. We'll have a look at one of the key fighting elements within the Myanmar armed forces. That is the light infantry division. There's 10 of those. And those forces right now are what is keeping control and the current military government in power. So more to come on that coverage soon. We're watching that very closely, and it's going to become even a more focused part of our coverage. We also plan on continued coverage of the ongoing war in the failed state, or the former state, of Ethiopia. Obviously, we continue to see fighting in Oromia, There is open civil war taking place in the Amhara region, and just continues to be an incredibly brutal conflict led by the tyrant Abiy Ahmed. So more to come very soon. As always, thank you for joining us today. Have a good day.